The notification from his dock security system came through at 6:18 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and David Martinez knew immediately something was wrong. The maritime construction engineer had installed his own cameras 3 months ago after the HOA started their campaign of harassment, but what he saw on his phone screen made his coffee go cold. 2 men in HOA vests were drilling mounting brackets into his private dock pilings, installing what looked like high-end surveillance equipment pointed directly at his boat slip. This wasn't the first time the Harborview Heights HOA had overstepped their boundaries. For 6 months, they've been sending violation notices, threatening fines, demanding he remove his commercial fishing vessel from their marina. But David had stayed quiet, documenting everything, because what the HOA president and his board didn't know was that David didn't just own his waterfront property. He owned the underlying marina permit that gave the entire development its water access rights. And today, watching them literally drill into his property, David decided it was time they learn exactly who controlled these waters. Before we dive into how a HOA's power trip turned into their worst nightmare when they targeted the wrong boat owner. If you love stories where entitled board members finally meet someone who knows exactly how to put them in their place, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. This is a story in 3 parts. The systematic harassment that pushed a maritime professional past his breaking point. The confrontation where a HOA board discovered they'd been bullying the one person who could shut down their entire waterfront. And the resolution where property rights and legal leverage delivered the kind of justice that makes you believe karma really does exist. In the first part, you'll witness 6 months of escalating intimidation tactics from a HOA board drunk on manufactured authority. David Martinez had purchased his waterfront home specifically for his work in commercial maritime construction. But the newly elected HOA president saw his fishing vessel as an eyesore that lowered property values. What started as polite requests became threatening letters, then fines that had no legal basis, then surveillance and confrontation. David endured it all quietly, documenting every overreach, every threat, every violation of his actual property rights. Because unlike the HOA board, David understood exactly what legal grounds he stood on, and he was waiting for them to go far enough that the lesson would stick. In the second part, the power dynamic shifts completely when David catches the HOA installing unauthorized surveillance equipment on his private dock. The confrontation begins with HOA President Richard Vance's smug confidence that he has every right to monitor community waters. That confidence evaporates rapidly when David reveals not just the extent of his documentation, but the legal reality that the HOA board has apparently never bothered to research. Every marina slip, every dock, every foot of water access in Harborview Heights exists because of a single commercial marina permit issued 30 years ago. A permit that David purchased along with his property. A permit he can modify, restrict, or revoke entirely. The board president's face when he realizes what he's done is the moment everything changes. In the third part, justice unfolds in layers as David exercises rights the HOA never imagined existed. What follows isn't just vindication for one homeowner. It's a restructuring of power in an entire waterfront community. The cameras come down, but that's just the beginning. The resolution involves lawyers, emergency board meetings, homeowners discovering what their leadership has been hiding, and consequences that ripple through property values and community leadership in ways no one anticipated. The satisfaction isn't just in watching entitled board members face accountability. It's in seeing an entire community learn the difference between actual authority and the illusion of power. Here's exactly how it happened. David Martinez, 43, had spent 20 years in maritime construction engineering, building everything from commercial fishing docks to luxury marina developments along the Gulf Coast. When he purchased the waterfront property at 847 Harborview Circle 15 months ago, he'd done what he always did: comprehensive research on every permit, easement, and property right associated with the land. The house itself was modest, a Three-bedroom ranch with direct water access. But what made it valuable to David was the deep water slip that could accommodate his 32-foot commercial fishing vessel, the Maria Elena, named for his late mother. He used the boat for work, conducting underwater surveys and equipment tests for his consulting firm. The vessel was licensed, insured, properly maintained, and completely within his rights to dock at his own property. But 3 months after David moved in, the Harborview Heights HOA held elections, and Richard Vance, a retired real estate investor who'd made his money flipping waterfront condos, took over as president with a mandate to elevate the community's image. The first notice came on a Monday morning in late March, tucked under David's windshield wiper. Violation notice: commercial vessel in residential marina. Remove within 14 days or face $500 weekly fines. David read it twice, standing in his driveway in work boots and a weather-beaten jacket, then calmly photographed it and filed it with the growing stack of HOA correspondence he'd been collecting. He didn't respond. He knew the notice had no legal standing. The second escalation happened 3 weeks later when David returned from a 5-day project in Galveston. Someone had placed orange traffic cones across his boat slip entrance and tied a laminated sign to his dock railing, "Unauthorized commercial USE docking prohibited." David removed the cones, cut off the sign, and this time he checked his security camera footage. The timestamp showed Richard Vance himself, accompanied by 2 board members, placing the barriers at 11 a.m. on a Thursday. They'd been on his private dock, touching his property, restricting his access. David saved the footage to 3 separate drives and still said nothing. But the third incident was different. David had been working a night shift, overseeing emergency repairs on a damaged pier after a storm. He arrived home at 4 a.m., exhausted, and running on his 3rd cup of gas station coffee, to find his boat slip access completely blocked by a massive floating dock section that hadn't been there 12 hours earlier. Someone had repositioned the community dock float directly across his slip entrance. It would take a crane to move it. David sat in his truck, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the sun come up over water he couldn't access. He'd filed the police report that morning. The responding officer had been sympathetic but clear. This was a civil matter, a property dispute that courts would need to resolve. David had nodded, thanked him, and driven to his office where he pulled out every property document related to his home purchase. He spent that entire weekend researching. Not his property rights. He already knew those code. He researched the HOA's history, their legal structure, their board members' backgrounds, their finances, and he found it, buried in the developments. Original paperwork from 1994, a detail that the current HOA leadership had apparently never bothered to understand. Harborview Heights' entire water access, all 43 boat slips, the community dock, even the decorative waterfront pavilion, existed under a single commercial marina permit, permit number GC 199408447M, issued to Martinez Marine Holdings LLC, David's company, inherited from his father, who'd been the original marina developer before selling off the residential lots, but retaining the underlying water rights. David purchased his property. He'd specifically chosen the one parcel that came with full permit ownership. He didn't just own a boat slip. He owned the legal authority for every boat slip in the development. And the HOA, in their arrogance, had just spent 6 months harassing the one person who could shut down their entire waterfront. David made phone calls. He consulted with his maritime attorney. He drafted documents. And then he waited, because he knew Richard Vance's type. Bullies always escalate when their initial tactics fail. They can't help themselves. David just needed them to push far enough that the entire community would see exactly what their HOA leadership had become. The notification on that Tuesday morning in September was what David had been waiting for. He watched the live feed as 2 men he didn't recognize drilled into his dock pilings, mounting brackets for what appeared to be commercial-grade surveillance cameras. David smiled for the first time in weeks, saved the footage, and headed to his garage. He pulled on his work jacket, grabbed the toolbox he wouldn't need, but that looked official, and walked down his sloped backyard to his private dock. The two installers didn't notice him at first, too focused on running cable from the camera to a power junction box they'd apparently mounted to his dock electrical panel. When David cleared his throat, both men jumped. He stood there, 6'2" and sun-weathered from decades of waterfront work, and spoke calmly. "Gentlemen, whose authorization do you have to be drilling into my property?" The older installer, maybe 50 with a contractor's tan and wary eyes, gestured toward the main HOA building visible across the Marina Basin. "HOA president hired us. Said these were community dock improvements." David nodded slowly. "And did the HOA president mention that this is private property? That this dock, these pilings, this electrical system, all belong to me personally and aren't part of any community easement?" The younger installer looked at his partner nervously. The older man pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Vance." David smiled. "Please do. In fact, tell him to bring the whole board. I'll wait right here." 20 minutes later, Richard Vance appeared at the top of David's yard. Flanked by board members Patricia Holbrook and James Chun, Vance was exactly what David expected. Mid-60s. Golf shirt, expensive sunglasses, the confident stride of someone who'd never been seriously challenged. He didn't even make it all the way to the dock before he started talking. "Martinez, this surveillance is for community security. We've had reports of suspicious activity around the marina, and your vessel's presence requires monitoring." David let him finish. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the water with the projection of someone used to shouting instructions over boat engines and construction noise. "Richard, let me make sure I understand. You've been sending me violation notices for 6 months, claiming my commercial vessel violates community standards. You've blocked my boat slip access twice. You've threatened fines that total over $12,000. And now you've hired contractors to drill surveillance equipment into my private dock without permission, consent, or legal authority. Do I have that timeline correct?" Vance's confident smile flickered. "This is community property, Martinez. You don't get to—" "Stop talking," David interrupted, his tone still calm, but with an edge that made everyone on the dock go silent. "I'm going to tell you something once, and I need you to listen very carefully. Then I'm going to give you 2 options, and you're going to pick one immediately." He pulled out his phone, opened the folder, and held up the screen showing the original Marina permit documents. "This development exists on water access granted by Gulf Coast Commercial Marina Permit, GC 1994-0847M, issued June 1994 to Martinez Marine Holdings, LLC. That's my company. Inherited from my father, who developed this entire marina before selling the residential parcels. Every boat slip in Harborview Heights, including yours, Richard, exists because I maintain and renew that permit annually. The permit holder has authority over slip assignments, water access, dock modifications, and yes, power supply to all marine electrical systems." Patricia Holbrook's face had gone pale. James Chun was frantically typing on his phone, presumably looking up permit records. Richard Vance opened his mouth, then closed it. "For 6 months, David continued, you've been harassing the one homeowner in this development who actually controls whether your boats have legal docking rights. You've trespassed on my property. You've restricted my access. You've threatened illegal fines. And this morning, you authorized contractors to drill into my private dock and install surveillance equipment without permission. So here are your 2 options." He held up one finger. "Option 1, I call my attorney right now. We file criminal trespassing charges against you personally, Richard, and civil suits against the HOA for harassment, property damage, and intentional interference with my business operations. I provide all my documentation, all my camera footage, all your threatening letters to the judge. Then, because I'm feeling petty after 6 months of your bullying, I modified a marina permit to exclude HOA administrative access to electrical systems. Your community dock loses power. Your boat lift stops working. Every homeowner here starts asking why their HOA president picked a fight with the permit holder. He held up a second finger. Option 2. Those cameras come down right now. Every violation notice you sent me gets formally rescinded in writing. You resign as HOA president effective immediately and recommend a special election. You personally apologize to me in front of the full HOA membership at the next meeting. And most importantly, you never ever contact me about my boat again. The silence stretched for 15 seconds. Then Richard Vance said, in a voice that had lost all its authority, "What about the fines we already?" David cut him off. "Those fines were never legal, Richard. You have no authority to fine me for keeping a properly registered vessel at my private dock. But if you're worried about money, I should mention that the contractors you hired, they owe me $300 for the repair work they'll need to do to patch the holes they drilled in my pilings. I'll be sending you that invoice." Patricia Holbrook stepped forward. "David, we didn't know about the permit situation. Richard handles all the legal. Then maybe the board should start reading the documents they're supposed to govern under," David said flatly. He turned back to Vance. "You have 60 seconds to pick an option. After that, I'm pulling the main power breaker for the community dock system and calling my lawyer. Choose." Richard Vance stared at David like he was seeing him for the first time. Then he turned to the contractors and said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Take the cameras down." David watched them leave, all 5 of them, trudging back up his yard toward their vehicles. The contractors started removing the surveillance equipment, working carefully under David's observation to repair the damage they'd done. And for the first time in 6 months, David Martinez sat down on his own dock, looked out at his boat floating peacefully in the morning sun, and smiled. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or lawyers. Sometimes it comes from knowing exactly what you own and exactly when to use it. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Thursday, and by 6:45, the community center was packed with more homeowners than had attended in the past 3 years combined. Word had spread fast. David arrived exactly on time, carrying a folder of documents and his laptop, and took a seat in the back row. Richard Vance was already at the front table, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 5 days. Patricia Holbrook and James Chun flanked him, both studiously avoiding eye contact with the crowd. The meeting opened with standard business, budget reports that no one listened to, until they reached new business on the agenda. Vance cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, I need to address a situation regarding Slip 847 and recent misunderstandings about property rights in the Marina." David didn't move. He watched as Vance stumbled through a prepared statement that his lawyer had clearly written, rescinding all violation notices, acknowledging that David's vessel was properly authorized, apologizing for administrative overreach. The word resign never came up. David stood. Every head in the room turned. "Point of order," David said clearly. "Richard, we discussed your resignation as part of our agreement. Was that something you forgot to mention?" The room erupted. Homeowners started shouting questions, demanding explanations. Patricia Holbrook leaned over to whisper frantically in Vance's ear. David walked to the front, plugged his laptop into the projector, and pulled up the Marina permit documents. "Since there seems to be confusion," David said over the noise, "let me explain what's been happening." He walked the room through everything. The permit history, his ownership, the 6 months of harassment, the unauthorized surveillance installation. He showed photos of the blocked boat slip, copies of the threatening letters, security footage of HOA board members trespassing on his property. When he was finished, the room was silent again, but this time it was the heavy silence of anger redirected. Janet Wheeler, who lived 3 houses down from David and kept a sailboat she'd owned for 20 years, stood up. "Richard, did you seriously threaten the permit holder? The person who legally controls whether our boats can dock here?" Another homeowner, Marcus Thompson, chimed in. I got a violation notice last month about my dock box placement. Was that legal either? Or have you just been making up rules?" The meeting dissolved into chaos. Richard Vance tried to maintain order, failed, and ultimately did what David had known he'd have to do. He announced his resignation, effective immediately, and walked out of the community center without another word. Patricia Holbrook took over as interim president and immediately moved to form a committee to review all HOA policies and hire an actual maritime attorney to advise them. But the biggest change came 3 days later when the full HOA membership voted 38-4 to formally acknowledge David's permit ownership in their governing documents and establish a permanent liaison position between the board and the permit holder to ensure nothing like this ever happened again. They offered the liaison position to David. He declined politely but agreed to serve as an advisor. The contractors Richard Vance had hired finished their repair work on David's dock pilings. And true to his word, David sent Vance an invoice for $300. It was paid within a week from Vance's personal account. David never saw Richard Vance at another community event. Word through the neighborhood grapevine said he'd listed his property for sale within a month and moved to a condo development in Sarasota where HOA drama didn't involve maritime law. As for the surveillance cameras, David kept his own security system running. But now it was recording a peaceful marina where no one blocked his slip, threatened his property rights, or questioned his vessel's right to dock at his own home. 2 months later, David Martinez sat on his back deck on a Saturday morning, coffee steaming in the cool October air, watching boats come and go through the Marina Channel. The Maria Elena floated in her slip, ready for Monday's project surveying a new commercial pier foundation in Port Arthur. His neighbor Janet stopped by with fresh cinnamon rolls from the bakery, thanking him again for standing up to Richard's nonsense and mentioning that 3 other homeowners had been getting similar harassment for minor dock modifications. The new HOA board had rescinded those notices too, once they actually read the permit guidelines. David took a bite of cinnamon roll and watched the sunrise paint the water gold. He thought about his father, who built this marina 30 years ago with the dream of creating a community where people who loved the water could build homes near their boats. His father had always said that respecting property rights and understanding law was the foundation of any good neighborhood. Richard Vance and his board had forgotten that lesson, or maybe they'd never learned it. They'd seen authority as a weapon instead of a responsibility. But David had learned something too. He'd spend 6 months documenting, researching, waiting for the right moment instead of reacting in anger. And when that moment came, the resolution hadn't required shouting or threats. Just facts, legal leverage, and the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what they owned and exactly how to protect it. Justice, David reflected as he finished his coffee, doesn't always come from courtrooms or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it comes from knowing your rights, having the patience to let bullies overreach, and the spine to hold them accountable when they do. And as David sat there in the peace he'd fought for, he smiled. Because justice, whether served hot in the moment or cold after careful planning, was equally satisfying across the country in Bend, Oregon. Margaret Sullivan was unlocking her bakery at 5 a.m. when the building inspector knocked on her door with a compliance violation that made no sense. The 62-year-old grandmother had run Sullivan's Corner Bakery for 38 years. Same location, same recipes. Same brick oven her father built in 1967. But the new city council member who campaigned on modernizing downtown apparently decided her historic storefront didn't fit his vision. What he didn't know was that Margaret's great-grandfather had been on the original city planning commission. And the building she owned sat on one of 3 properties with a grandfather commercial exemption that predated every zoning law the councilman was trying to weaponize. You'll need to remove your outdoor seating and repaint in approved colors within 30 days, the inspector said, reading from a form without making eye contact. Margaret smiled, the same smile she'd given her children when they tried to convince her they cleaned their rooms when she could still see toys under the bed. I think you should call your supervisor, she said sweetly. And maybe bring a lawyer. This is going to get interesting. But that's a story for another time.